speak out for nature. And all of this is in the context of the climate and ecological emergency, and pretty much everybody felt that we all need to act urgently together because nature is in crisis. So the strategy has this as our vision: a Somerset-wide nature recovery network, creating more space for wildlife, benefiting everyone, and playing its part in helping us reverse biodiversity loss and tackling climate change. So just want to pull a couple of things out of that one. So with Somerset Wide, we are looking at covering the whole county. Our nature recovery network sounds a bit of jargon, I know. So just to explain that a little bit, it's about the core sites, our protected sites, not just our sites as Somerset Wildlife Trust, but the SSSIs, the National Nature Reserves, the designated sites that have become refuges for many species. It's about protecting those, but connecting those up, improving the wider landscape so that species can expand and travel through the wider landscape and create more space for wildlife at the same time. So it's not about just managing the status quo, but more space for nature. And people are really important too. So making sure that everybody benefits from nature. We've all found that, haven't we, over lockdown? Both physically and mentally, nature's been really important to so many people, and we want to make sure that people can benefit, but also that by doing this, by allowing nature to recover, it can contribute to tackling some of the big challenges that we have, and the biggest one of those is climate change, but will also reverse biodiversity loss. So that's our vision for 2030, and our role as Somerset Wildlife Trust in this is to work for the changes needed for nature and people to thrive together. So that's our commitment to you, if you like, of what we are going to do. And so we've set ourselves 3 interconnected goals, and they all work together. We need all of them to achieve what we want to achieve. And goal 1, nature's recovery, is really what we're going to be talking about tonight, and that's what the speakers are going to be addressing different aspects of. But the general idea, and I won't go into too much detail, is that nature is improving everywhere across the whole county, but that there is at least 30% of land and sea that is positively managed for nature. So the 30% is an international target, it's a national target, and as one of 46 wildlife trusts covering the whole of the UK, it is our shared target as well. And we have done some work with Somerset Environmental Records Centre to establish a baseline, and we think our baseline for Somerset is 10%. So we have got some work to do there. It's also really important to say that we've included the sea. So we have a fantastic, excuse me, a fantastic coast in Somerset, and we need to do more to ensure that the intertidal and coastal habitats are protected and restored as well. Goal 2 is about people, and we will be putting an event on later in the year to explore this in more depth and how people can get involved. But the key points for this is that everyone has the opportunity to experience nature. If people don't experience nature, they won't value it, and if they don't value it, they're not going to take action to protect it. So we want everybody to have that experience. But we also want to create a movement for nature by having at least 1 in 4 people take action, take actual proper proactive action for nature's recovery across Somerset. And we're calling this Team Wilder. And there's a lot of science behind that, showing that if you can get 25% of the population doing something visibly, it encourages others to get involved. So we want people taking action at home, at work, in their schools, in their churches, in their communities, and we'll be looking at ways that we can support you to do that over the course of this strategy. And finally, goal 3 is about telling Somerset's story, telling the story of nature. And this is in partnership with Somerset Environmental Records Centre. We'll be creating an online state of nature platform that monitors the progress, and it is also used to inform where we target our delivery and target our action. And Team Wilder will be involved in this approach because we are going to do much more citizen science, and we're going to be relaunching launching later in the year the Great Somerset Wildlife Count, where we'll be asking people to go out and tell us how common are those common species in Somerset? Are they as common as we think? And over time, we'll build up trends and patterns and be able to actually fully understand what's happening in the county of Somerset. So what's different? How is that different from what we've been doing before? Somerset Wildlife Trust will be working across three main areas. So delivering, we will continue to deliver projects on our nature reserves and in our communities and with our partners. These are just a few of the key things that are in the strategy. There are more, I've just highlighted a few. We will be looking to acquire land to buffer our nature reserves and look at restoring natural processes. We'll be focusing much more on building wider partnerships with communities, landowners and farmers. And we also want to look at what does a good look like for nature-based solutions for carbon storage or for phosphate mitigation. What does that look like if it's also restoring native habitats? And our wholly owned subsidiary, our consultancy, First Ecology, will be looking at how to achieve really good biodiversity net gain by providing high quality environmental services. So deliver is key, but we will also be looking to influence others. And these are some of the areas where we'll be looking to influence planning and policy so that they deliver the best outcomes for nature. How we can work with others to positively manage their land for nature, and how we work with communities. And key to that is actually we want to learn from you. We need to know how we can support you so that you can take action. And then the final area is that we will be calling for change, and we will be using our evidence base to call for change. So we will be calling for a planning system that works for nature and for our communities, for a restoration of peatlands, for a strong and ambitious Environment Act, and we welcome the news yesterday that there will be a legally binding target, and for government support for regenerative farming, and for an end to damaging practices such as the overuse of pesticides or using peat as compost. And again, some welcome news yesterday, but we've still got a way to go to make sure that that happens. So before I finish, I just wanted to share with you an exciting new project for Somerset Wildlife Trust. We are in the process of acquiring Honeygar Farm, which is in the Avalon Marshes on the Somerset Levels. And we see this as a huge opportunity for Somerset Wildlife Trust to deliver all three of our goals that I've just outlined to you. So it's a really key part of the landscape, the ecological network. It provides a lot of connectivity between the existing sites. It's a fantastic science project, and we're partnering with the University of West of England to do a huge baseline study of the ecology, the water, carbon storage, and there'll be lots of opportunities for citizen science and people to get involved in working on with us on that. And it's a great opportunity for us to provide experiences for people to connect with nature. So there'll be more on this later, and we will be launching a major fundraising campaign, so keep your eye out for that. So just want to end by saying you're all Team Wilder, and I really look forward to working with you and hearing from you what we can do to support you over the next 10 years. So we will be looking at building our capacity and resources to be able to support you. I hope you enjoyed the talks this evening, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Georgia, and thank you all of you who contributed to this. What's great about this is that it's bottom up. It's obviously led by the Trust, but we're really trying to listen to all the people in Somerset, whatever their background, to get a consensus of how we move forward. I'd like now to introduce Professor Alistair Driver. Alistair is a really expert ecologist with over 40 years professional experience. He became the National Head of Conservation for the Environment Agency for England and Wales in 2002, and since 2017 he's been Director of Rewilding Britain. And tonight Alistair is going to explain the key principles of rewilding, a word that we hear a lot of, and how it has a key role to play in restoring biodiversity. Over to you, Alistair.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you for this invitation to speak. A real privilege for me to be able to present to you. I started my career with the Wildlife Trust in Gloucestershire in 1978, and it's been an amazing journey for me. I'm now Director of Rewilding Britain, as Stephen has mentioned. And I'm just going to give you a quick run through where we're up to with rewilding. Things have been moving at a fair old pace in the last couple of years, and it's actually quite hard to keep up with everything, which is a nice position to be in. We at Rewilding Britain are a tiny organisation. We intend to remain very small. We've got 7 FTEs worth of people, about a dozen of us working part-time. I work part-time myself, covering England and Wales. I'm going to focus as best I can on Lowland Britain and relevance to Somerset in particular during this presentation. And I'm going to share with you some latest stats. I've just done some revised analysis of the 25 large-scale rewilding projects that I'm dealing with in England, and I'll share some of those stats with you, which are hot off the press. I did this earlier in the week. So first of all, just need to get this premise out there that I hope everyone will accept. I feel I can say it, after over 40 years as a traditional nature conservationist, if you like. It's not enough to just be managing nature reserves and protected sites. We need something else besides. We need that something else to be affordable. And my firm belief is that something else is rewilding. And I must emphasize, this is not instead of nature conservation, traditional nature conservation, nature reserves, protected sites, good planning policies, stewardship schemes, etc. It's not instead of that, it's as well as that. But it's on the basis that we simply cannot afford to keep creating more management intensive nature reserves. We need something complementary. So the next step then is for me to explain as succinctly as possible what I mean by rewilding, and essentially in a tweetable version is this large scale restoration of ecosystems to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself. And that needs to focus on restoration of natural processes. And sometimes that will involve reintroducing species, keystone species that are part or should be part of that natural process functioning. But a really important thing to remember with this is that this is a long journey, and getting to the point where nature is allowed to take care of itself will take decades. And we may not even get to that point. That's not for us to decide. That's for future generations to decide. Should we go the whole way and reintroduce the full suite of predators, etc. But right now, we've got a big enough job to do in terms of restoring natural, healthy, functioning ecosystems where natural processes prevail. So we should focus on the journey, moving in that direction, rather than jumping to the ultimate destination of rewilded. Now, a lot of people will say, well, how the heck can we produce food if we rewild everywhere? Well, no one's talking about rewilding everywhere. We're talking about, in Rewilding Britain, we talk about 5% of Britain being rewilded. That's roughly 1 million hectares. And that is, we would suggest, that is part of the 30% that the Wildlife Trusts and others are talking about. So we'd like to see this 5% rewilding connected with and buffered by 25% of nature-friendly farming, forestry, etc. And some of the key characteristics of rewilding areas, well, size matters when it comes to rewilding. So we'd expect them to be at least, say, ideally at least 1,500 acres in size. Natural regeneration must be allowed to prevail in rewilding areas. If it's not, then it's not rewilding. There obviously should be minimal intervention in terms of human activity, but it's accepted that a lot of intervention will be needed to kickstart the recovery of natural processes. There would be no applications of chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, etc., apart from essential vaccinations, medications for animal welfare purposes. These are the sorts of criteria that would apply to a rewilding area, which would be more relaxed in a nature recovery area, a nature-friendly land use, if you like. And on the subject of food, I just wanted to flag this stat that's emerged now from these rewilding projects, that because we don't have the native herbivores of bison and elk and boar and beaver in all the right places, it's important that we have proxies for those, and those proxies are rare breed animals, mainly cattle and pigs, and of course we have wild deer as well. And because we've got these proxies, all of these rewilding sites still produce food. If they're going to have these animals in order to create this heterogeneity in the landscape, then those animals will need to be harvested. You know, they will need to, the numbers will need to be regulated in order for a roughly natural process situation to develop. And so if they're being harvested, then they can produce food. And so the livestock units on the 26 sites that I've analysed are 55% of those pre-rewilding. So it's not total abandonment of food production, which you might often read in the press. And interestingly, the entire reduction is down to sheep. In fact, the numbers of cattle and pigs and red deer have increased slightly overall across the rewilding sites. I'm just going to run this Lowland animation courtesy of NEP. It's a generic animation that shows how rewilding would develop or might develop in a lowland situation with infrastructure, as you can see, and quite a heavily farmed landscape. And this is the kind of change that one might expect to see. And the first thing is, you know, to recognize that there will be pockets where it's possible to quickly allow natural regen to take place. Corridors of connectivity are really important, and so that should be a focus in the early stages of big rewilding projects, being able to connect wilder areas with each other, and looking for opportunities to restore rivers and wetlands, for example. I know from 35 years working on rivers and wetlands that, you know, you get instant gratification, if you like, when it comes to this type of habitat, because river and wetland environments respond really quickly to restoration. But one can end up with significant core areas of rewilding interspersed with other areas which are perhaps more nature-friendly farming. But there should be significant core areas, and generally speaking, these will be focused around river corridors in many cases in lowland situations. But the important thing to notice is there are still people in this landscape. There is still human activity. There are still grazing animals in this landscape. This is not total abandonment, as some people might have you believe. The benefits of rewilding are becoming increasingly well known, and you've got some great examples in Somerset of the benefits of certain types of intervention, which are in effect the types of intervention that one might apply to kickstart natural processes. These are examples from my days in the Environment Agency, and actually I'm really pleased. I've just had a conversation today with Heal Rewilding, who have some volunteers who are going to pull together more and better evidence of the benefits of restoring our land and water in rewilding projects. So we're going to build a directory of this kind of stuff. But you know, you've got great examples on your doorstep of reductions in peak flows and improvements in water quality through reintroduction of beaver, for example. Some very significant improvements in sediment reduction, nitrates, phosphates, etc. Through beaver reintroduction. We need more and better evidence to convince the powers that be that they should support organisations like yours in their rewilding interests, but it's moving in the right direction. And there's increasing evidence about the economic viability of rewilding. Very important stat, probably the most important stat from the analysis of these projects that I've just done, is that the jobs increase by approximately 50% compared with traditional farming beforehand. You know, farming is actually quite a low jobs per hectare kind of activity. Rewilding almost always involves diversification, and that leads to an increase in jobs overall, which is very important. and an almost tenfold increase in volunteer numbers, which is fantastic to see, because there are obvious health and well-being benefits associated with that. So these sorts of nature-based tourism activities and other activities are the sorts of things that rewilding projects are delivering around the country and creating jobs and volunteer opportunities with them. I'm going to run this a couple of times, but this serves to remind us that natural regeneration is key. We don't necessarily need to jump straight to tree planting, and obviously we've been batting hard for natural regen in the future tree strategy, and I'm delighted that yesterday it was announced that that would be the case. I'll just run this again. This is the Knepp estate, and it shows you an arable field with good hedgerows, exclusion of animals to start with, and then allowing animals into the landscape, breaking up of land drains, and then letting nature do its thing. And you can see over a 15-year period, after a few years, trees and scrub are coming in. Water is starting to sit on the land because land drains have been broken up. And this wonderful mosaic of habitats has appeared just in 15 years. Far more resilient than a tree planting program. I'm not excluding tree planting from the list of interventions. It's just that there should be a hierarchical approach. And in many parts of southern Britain, natural regen will do the job for you where you've got good tree seed sources nearby. Then there's the issue of reintroductions. And again, good news yesterday, the government is going to establish a reintroductions task group, which is great. They mentioned golden eagle, they mentioned wildcat, they mentioned beaver during the Secretary of State's presentation and Q&A yesterday. That's great. You know, we need these animals back. We've sat for ages and anxiously worried about bringing things back whilst watching so many species go down the pan. It's time now for us to man up, basically, and take the plunge. We've got plenty of great examples out there, like the white-tailed eagle, like the pine marten, white stork, which have been hugely successful with the right planning, the right consultation. There's no reason why we can't do more and better. Finally, I just want to commend the Wildlife Trust, Somerset Wildlife Trust, for the strategy. I've looked through it. I'm very pleased with what I see. This particular section here with these references to wilder key areas, developing large-scale landscape scale projects, absolutely fundamental. My plea to you is, when you're talking about landscape scale, it needs to be truly landscape scale. I've worked on what I called landscape scale projects in the past in the Environment Agency, and they were 500 acres or maybe 500 hectares if we were lucky, but they weren't truly landscape scale. You need to be able to look in every direction and say, right, we have improved the biodiversity value of that by rewilding it, by restoring natural processes at that kind of scale. So you need to be ambitious, and I know you folks at the Trust are not guilty of this, but there are plenty of parts of society that need to free up their thinking. This cartoon by Ralph Underhill summarizes it very nicely, and reflecting some of the thoughts of those who go around shooting things but don't want nature to be interfering with that. So I'll leave it there. Happy to take questions later. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you for that visionary and really motivational approach. It's very inspiring, and love the idea of being able to look all around you and see rewilding wherever you look. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Andy Clements. Andy began in 1982 his career with the Nature Conservancy Council as an ornithologist. He helped to set up Natural England, then set up his own consultancy, and then joined the British Trust for Ornithology, fantastic organisation, as chief executive in 2007, and was there for over a decade and left December last year. He became a non-executive board member of Natural England, and he chairs the Natural England Science Advisory Committee and the National Nature Reserve Partnership. So over to you, Andy.
evening.
You've got your microphone off, Andy.
Okay. Thanks very much indeed, Stephen, for the introduction, and thank you to Georgia and the team for the invitation to speak at this evening's wonderful event. It's really great to see Somerset Wildlife Trust's strategy from now until 2030 and how it chimes with many of the elements of modern progressive nature conservation that we're hearing about this evening, and for example that Alistair spoke about just now. Yeah, once again, I'm one of these old guys that's been around for 40 years in nature conservation, but I do hope that I still have something wise to say about that. And I feel very privileged actually to be part of the Natural England Board at the present time. And I think this was illustrated very well yesterday by the Wildlife Trust's event and the speech by the Secretary of State. We're here in a moment. This is unlike any other moment during the 40 years that I've been involved in nature conservation. A number of different things are lining up. We've got the biodiversity crisis alongside the climate change crisis as something equivalent finally. We've got a super year for nature this year with the biodiversity conference of the parties and the climate change conference of the parties later on in the year, and that has ensured that our government are really really ambitious around their own policies for future progressive nature conservation over the next decade or so. And it was very clear in what the Secretary of State said yesterday, and actually in the quality of the questions that the Wildlife Trust leader, Craig, was presenting the Secretary of State, and his responses to them, which on the whole were really sound, mean that I think for the first time we've got ambition lining up with some of the implementation that we really need to see. And it, as I say, a privilege to be part of Natural England at this time with the great leadership we have both in Marion Spain and Tony Juniper, and indeed in a growing budget finally over last year and this year we've had good news. So I just want to take you to the next slide and talk very briefly about what the last 70 years of nature reserves have been about. And Alistair was very right when he said that, you know, we need something else as well. But what we mustn't do is ignore what it is that nature reserves have given us over that period of time. We've had very strong legislation that first of all enabled the conservation movement to arrest damage in certain situations, and then latterly new legislation that enabled us to work much more positively with landowners and land users around the management of those nature reserves. But it's quite right that some people have said, you know, that nature reserves are not enough, and they may have been the bedrock of saving nature for those 70 years. But it may also be the case that, and I've heard it said by others, that nature reserves are kind of the panic button of saving nature. You know, they were the last ditch things at times when it was really tough. But I think the combination of those aspects means that nature reserves are very important in our history and also will be extremely important in our future progressive kind of nature conservation. And we have had notable wins with the EU legislation in particular. And I think at this moment we have to pay attention to what the Secretary of State said yesterday about the Environment Bill looking to improve the protection in domestic legislation, and be careful not to throw away the baby with the bathwater, because the EU legislation has given us some very strong wins. So a decade or so ago, many of you will know what Making Space for Nature stands for. Professor Sir John Lawton engaged a team of professionals across the nature conservation sector to think about how we could improve things then. And this is it coined the term Making Space for Nature, and also what he and his team said was that we still needed nature reserves. They were really important, and that's what the schematic on the left-hand side of this slide shows. But we needed more areas protected, we needed them bigger, we needed them better managed, and importantly, we needed them joined together. And of course, that was the initial thinking that has led into today's response by government and others, and by the Wildlife Trust, by yourselves, into wanting to contribute to a national nature recovery network. And I think what this work did was signal how protected areas are going to work much harder for modern society, and the way modern society wants to engage with nature protection for the future. As Stephen said, one of the things that I do for the Board of Natural England is that I chair the National Nature Reserve Partnership. And of course, the Wildlife Trusts are extremely active in this partnership. And I think it would be right to say that a few years ago, national nature reserves were kind of seen as belonging to the statutory nature conservation body, to English Nature or to Natural England. And kind of there was a bit of legislation came along that deigned to approve organisations like the Wildlife Trust, but also private organisations, to say, yes, you can manage national nature reserves too. And I think what we've done over the last few years is kind of sweep away all of that kind of different perspectives on national nature reserves, and welcome in everybody who manages and uses national nature reserves into this collaborative partnership. And it's been a totally inspiring thing to do, and the Wildlife Trust have played a really strong part in this collaboration. We remember the three purposes of national nature reserves: to recover nature, to engage and welcome people to enjoy those places, and to use them as test beds for scientific experimentation. And when we come together as a collaboration, all of those bodies and individuals that manage national nature reserves, we can achieve more than we can as individuals. The sum is greater than the parts. And an example of this here in Purbeck are the Purbeck Heaths, where 7 partners have come together, sweeping away the boundaries practically, but sweeping away the boundaries in our minds too, to come together, work together, brand free for the good of the National Nature Reserve. And that's very much the vision around the Avalon Marshes here in Somerset too. And so I think the National Nature Reserve Partnership is a very important signal to how we want to make our protected areas and national nature reserves much more progressive and working for the whole of society in the future. And then finally, this brings me on to how much people need nature's recovery and need these special areas to be part of that. We've learned a lot of lessons during the pandemic about how people really, really need to be able to access green spaces and nature. People have come to national nature reserves and wildlife trust sites in their droves when the opportunities have arisen, and people have really begun to recognise what it is about nature that is so important for mental health and well-being. And I think we as a sector have a real duty now to work very strongly to make sure that our nature reserves and our protected areas serve the community equally, and equality, diversity and inclusion are really important principles for us to work towards more modern ways of engaging people in our wild landscape. And it's so good to see this as one of the 3 very strong objectives in the Somerset Wildlife Trust 2030 strategy. And of course that brings us back to the Nature Recovery Network, how locally the local nature reserves, nature recovery strategies will be part of that. And I'm delighted to see that Somerset Wildlife Trust have that well embedded in their strategy. And it really is a delight to be able to come and talk about how we've kind of grown our whole approach around protected areas for the future, and see Somerset Wildlife Trust playing such a strong role in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for stressing the importance of people in that, which I know is something that the Trust, the staff in particular, feel very strongly about, the whole health and well-being area. I'd now like to introduce one of our new trustees, Holly Purdy. Holly grew up on an organic Somerset dairy farm and went on to study wildlife and countryside conservation, started a career working for the Somerset Wildlife Trust and the National Trust. And then a few years ago, she returned to farming and she's gained a farm tenancy at Horner Farm on the edge of Exmoor. And she is establishing an agro-ecological model of farming with seasonal food events and farm education programmes. Holly, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. So you sort of covered who I am and my background. So I really have a really important role to play going forward here in Somerset. And it's about the integration of nature into our farming systems. It's not about separating nature from farming or nature from food production, but we have an integrated model that could deliver for all. So the impact farmers could be really significant here in Somerset. So 74% of land in Somerset is farmed in some form. So imagine if we all made some changes, and those could be small changes or large changes. And humans have been farming for the past 6,500 years, and many of the species have benefited from positive farming methods. However, 60% of species are in decline now on farmland. And that's been driven by intensification, and this has been sort of pushed through with markets and government policy. So sometimes it's about changing our perception of what we view. And I think as farmers, we can just view our own farm and we don't look at the wider landscape and the impact we have on it. We don't view how putting a fertiliser on one field could impact the water quality downstream. So this is actually our farm when we took it on in 2018. So we can monitor the changes as we make these sort of impacts in the wider landscape. So we put in herbal lays, silver pasture, wood pasture. We've installed about 2 kilometres of new hedgerows. And you can see as we fly over the farm, the sort of connectivity, the hedgerows that reach across the landscape. And these are really vital as we go forward. So I wanted to really start from the bottom up. So our soils. So our foundation as an ecosystem, we rely on them as humans and everything relies on them for their survival. So I'm just going to go through about some of the things we could do here in Somerset as farmers or as individuals and how we can improve things. So how can we support this healthy structure in our soils, and how can we store carbon while also protecting the fungi and the bacteria, which are essential? So we could be covering our bare soil. So what I mean by this is making sure we have cover crops on between cropping practices, ensure that we minimise the level of bare ground we have in our pasture. So minimal or no till is really beneficial for not destroying your soil structure, and it helps protect your fungi and bacteria, which is essential in a healthy ecosystem. Green manures as alternatives to fertilisers, rotations, and what I mean by this is crop rotations and also livestock rotations, and rest periods. You can never underestimate a rest period. So when we graze our grass so only 10% remains of our grass height, the roots stop growing. So that means that we no longer have that roots growing down and helping build our soils. But if we graze them to say we only graze 30% of our grass height, then the roots continue to grow underneath. And then also diversity in our plants. We really need diversity across the whole system, in our farming systems, in our soils. And then something that's really significant for Somerset is we need to talk about our grasslands. And we can manage these for diversity and production. And this has a positive impact on our animals and biodiversity. So a couple of examples are our varied spore type. Now this can lead to habitat for nesting sites, overwintering insects and mammals, feeding ground for birds and raptors, and carbon storage, the ability of our grasslands to mitigate climate change going forward when they're managed correctly could be really vital going forward. So farmers have this really important role to play. And plant diversity. So plant diversity in our grasslands aid biodiversity, but they also aid our animal health and the growth. So what I mean by that is, does certain species actually keep your animals healthier on your farm, lowering your need for insecticides or lowering your need for wormers, which have a negative effect on our biodiversity. And diverse species lead to resilience to disease and climate change. When we have monocultures, we're exposing ourselves to these significant pests or diseases coming in. And then adding layers. So what I mean by that is we're adding three-dimensional shape to our habitats, to our grasslands. Now, I should mention, it's very much about the right tree in the right place. Trees are not the answer everywhere, but actually they could be really positive in some of our grassland habitats, particularly where we're trying to buffer in woodlands. So in this case, we've deliberately chosen fields where we can extend and buffer from those woodland habitats. And it has great benefits for our animals. It provides shade and it provides shelter, browse, all again lowering the need for inputs into our system. And they're economically diverse. They can offer, wood fuel, they can offer fruiting, cropping practices. And so for the farmer, you're getting a multiple gain across the whole thing, and also significant gain for our nature recovery. And it again leads back to the soil. The microbiology in our soil, or the communication between the tree roots and the grassland roots, is really essential and actually really promotes positive grass growth and tree health. And again, carbon capture. So I wanted to talk about connectivity because hedgerow loss has been the cause decline in biodiversity. And I know I can't be the only one that when we drive around Somerset, we see large fields. And we really need to change this. So one of the things we've done on our farm is we found a map from 1853, and we have an ambitious plan to replant every single hedgerow that was found in 1853. Now, this isn't negative for us as a farmer, and there's a lot of funding out there to be able to do this. And there's a lot of advice about the right hedgerow and where we put it. But it brings, flood mitigation measures, the connectivity to allow populations to travel the landscape. It aids holistic grazing models, and again offers this browse, shade and shelter for our animals, soil health benefits, and a key one from a wildlife perspective, additional habitats. Now, the role of animals. Sometimes we can hear quite a negative view on animals, and particularly within the farming world, or against the farming world. But diversity in our animals will help to lead to diversity in our grasslands. So I believe in mimicking nature. So if we put in a monoculture of sheep, we will get a monoculture of grass. However, if we graze with cattle, sheep, goats, maybe poultry, we're producing a nutrient-rich food, but in creating diversity behind us. And each species plays a really unique role in habitats on farm to enhance nature. Close crop grasslands that allow thyme flowering, to allow the large blue butterfly. These are really important. So sheep have a role to play, and then cattle creating varied sward heights, trampling in new seeds. It's really essential that we see not just one animal, but a variety to build this positive ecosystem. And then they're also really essential for nutrient recycling. We really need to lower our need for oil-based fertilizers and associated emissions. You know, if we want to decarbonize our economy, then we really need to utilize our animals to do this, to lower our need for these fertilizers. And then one thing I wanted to touch on was just about the interactions within an ecosystem. Take time when you find a farmland and you have some longer grass sward, take time to sit there and see the interactions that are happening around you. So as our cattle and our sheep move through the sward, you'll see them kicking up the insects behind them, and the swallows swoop in, and then in turn, obviously the sparrowhawk swoops in and feeds itself. But these are really important, and everything has a role to play when it's managed correctly. And then I wanted to talk about communities. So when we as humans connect ourselves to the land, we become part of the communities with the animals, the plants and the soils. But when we break this chain of partnerships within these communities, we cause problems which we often don't see. So an example I wanted to give is we remove cows over winter because we've been pushed to intensify, to have bigger animals, to match the needs of the market. So we remove these animals over winter because they can't, they damage the land. And this in turn, no longer are we getting the manure on the fields. So we lose the dung beetle habitat. And then we lose the loss of the nutrient recycling benefits and the food sources. And then we increase our need for inputs because we've lost that nutrient recycling benefit. So nothing is without impact. And so we need to sometimes think about how these farming practices have changed really simple things, but actually really significant things. So as humans, I believe we need to rebuild these communities to build strength and resilience and the ability to adapt to climate change going forward. Remember, we are not separate from nature, but we are part of it, and our success and failures as farmers rely on it. Civilizations have fallen and risen based on their farming success and failures. I wanted to leave you with something positive. I truly believe we can make a difference and we can change. I hope that my sons will be the future farmers here in Somerset, and I hope to leave them, the farms, in a better state than I found it. So by farming in sync with nature, agro-ecological farmers grow abundant and diverse foods. They regenerate natural ecosystems, strengthen resilience to health and climate shocks, and they bring healthy food to our local markets. So thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, Holly. That was truly inspiring. Someone's put in, can we have you for Prime Minister, please? Or at least. Finally, of our panellists, before we go to the Q&A session, and thank you so much for all your brilliant questions, I'd like to introduce Simon Clarke. Simon is our Head of Nature Recovery at the Wildlife Trust. He joined the Trust in late 2019 after a long career in nature conservation, including with Natural England. He is focusing on delivering the nature recovery outside of nature reserves, one of the things absolutely at the centre of what we're doing here, and how restoring natural processes in a way that Holly so beautifully described can help tackle climate change and other issues across the county. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks to all the inspirational speakers who've spoken before me. Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Simon Clarke. I'm Head of Nature Recovery at Somerset Wildlife Trust, and I'm really excited and feel very privileged to be able to speak to you tonight to talk about our new strategy. What I'm going to focus on, as Georgia mentioned very early on, is about our nature recovery work. And our goal one, which is our goal to see nature improving everywhere, with, has been talked really greatly tonight, restore natural processes and connecting and protecting things through the nature recovery network, with at least 30% of land and sea being managed positively for nature. It's a big task, but it's one that we feel we're up for the challenge, and with our partners and with a variety of stakeholders and the wider community of Somerset, we're sure we can get there. The first thing I'm really going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about, there's a huge document we've got behind the strategy, which we spent a year putting together. But I'm going to talk about some of those highlights, some of the things that I'm really getting my teeth into at the moment. And the first thing I really want to talk about is the local nature recovery strategy and nature recovery networks. Andy and Alistair and others have talked about the Lawton Review, which was about connecting, buffering, creating bigger, more joined up landscapes where nature can thrive. And it's also been talked about how those joined up, thriving nature networks can actually help address some of those big things around climate change and ecological decline. So it's really, really exciting to be involved in delivering what will be a staple part of the Environment Bill, which is the nature recovery strategy. We're very privileged to be at the forefront of that in Somerset. Georgia is chair of the local nature partnership, and I'm actually chairing the local nature recovery strategy group within Somerset. And what that late nature recovery strategy group is actually doing is bringing together a whole range of stakeholders from the farming sector, from statutory authorities, from NGOs, from businesses, whole ranges of society together to try and come up with a joint and agreed strategy around nature recovery. We've already got some fantastic map mapping which we've produced, and the map that you can see in front of you is a draft nature recovery strategy. It's certainly not detailed, and in order for it to be detailed, we first of all need to get as much data together as we can on that, but also we need to engage with stakeholders, not just at a regional level, but at a local level. So the real nature recovery work comes at bringing that local communication and that local engagement and getting that embedded into the nature recovery strategy and the nature recovery plan. And then what the really important bit around that is then getting that embedded into some of the key processes around planning, around delivery of funding mechanisms, to ensure that we're getting the best benefit for society, for people, and of course wildlife in the county. So that's the one bit of work that we're working on. The next bit is about wilder landscapes, and it was fantastic to hear Alistair talking about the idea of big landscape scale projects which will really deliver nature recovery. And within that there would be a mosaic for things like rewilding, but there'd also be looking at ways that we might be able to improve nature on farms, and to look how we might be able to improve nature in villages, in towns, in urban areas, in a whole range of settings. So I'm going to very, very quickly come through the main priority areas that we see in the next 10 years. The first of these is the Mendeth Hills. We're calling this the Greater Mendeth Forest. And what this is about is actually creating a network that stretches all the way from the coast, right across the AONB, the Mendeth Hills AONB, right through East Mendeth to Frome and beyond. And that's going to be a mixture of grasslands, woodland networks, wetland networks, heathland networks. And we believe that that can be created. And within that, we can also embed a fantastic access network, and we can actually increase access and engagement in that for the wider public. The second of these is the Somerset Levels and Moors. We've got one of the most important wetland sites in Europe in Somerset, and we believe that, you know, the Somerset Levels and Moors, it's already a great place for wildlife. Andy mentioned earlier on about the Avalon Marshes, for example, and some of the great national nature reserves and wetland sites on the levels. We think we can build on that, and by working in partnership with stakeholders, particularly farmers and landowners, we can deliver much bigger, better wetlands and habitats that provide great ecosystem services, nature-based solutions for society. The third of these is the Brew Catchment. This is very, very exciting. We're looking at working right up from the top of the River Brew, up near Frome, all the way through right to the coast at Bridgewater Bay, and then linking that whole river system all the way through, creating networks of wetlands, peatlands that are thriving with nature and benefiting society and benefiting climate. And then the other project we're going to talk about, connecting the Blackdown Hills and the Quantocks. I'm very, very privileged to be involved with working with the Blackdown Hills AONB and the Quantock Hills AONB in their local nature recovery strategies. But what we also want to do is actually connect those protected sites. So create a network that stretches across South Somerset and actually creates a network that allows species to move between those two really important protected sites. And then finally, we're going to talk about the Paulden Hills. Again, another amazing landscape, as hills that run through the centre of Somerset. They're already really, really important for their nature reserves. And there we've got an amazing example of how a species has already been reintroduced. We've got the large blue butterfly that is now thriving on places like Collard Hill and Green Down and other locations there. And we believe we can build on that and build on that sort of pollinator network within that landscape. But it's also about delivering nature-based solutions. And I think Holly touched on this in her presentation. She talked about the importance of landscapes in not just providing food or but also providing a whole range of other services to people. So it's about soil, protecting our soils so they can be well structured, that they can support biodiversity and that they can support carbon and allow for, for production. It's about sequestering carbon. One of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment is the climate change emergency. And by using nature, by working with nature and creating more habitats and more nature-friendly areas and new landscapes, we believe that we can help tackle that crisis. But also lands can provide water quality, improve water quality and improve water storage, and therefore provide health and well-being to societies across Somerset. It's about using nature, working with nature, and having that underpin society and a thriving economy. So I'm going to give you a really, really good example of that. And Georgia's already mentioned Honeygar Farm. And she also mentioned about our new strategy is one about us being bold and is about looking to the future and building what we've already done. We have a fantastic range of nature reserves in Somerset that we and other partners manage. But Honeygar Farm for the Wildlife Trust is a totally new approach. We've actually purchased land that hasn't been managed principally for nature. This was a farm landscape until very, very recently. And what we want to do here is actually we want to demonstrate and test some of the new funding mechanisms and some of the new ways that we can try and improve landscapes for biodiversity, but also demonstrate that you can actually be rewarded as a landowner for providing those benefits. So for example, it's about looking at how the land might store carbon, or it might be how it might be able to offset phosphates. There is a process in Somerset at the moment where development has to be able to prove that it is neutral in terms of phosphate delivery before it can actually be approved. And we think that by delivering phosphates and showing how we can deliver phosphates on Honeygar, that can help with that process. And we're working with the local authorities in Natural England to develop our thinking around that. It's also about monitoring. We really, really want to be able to demonstrate that land can provide sequestration, and that by providing better soils, and by re-wetting land, that can improve the carbon sequestration ability. So we're going to be monitoring the landscape, and we're going to be developing a long-term monitoring programme with the University of West of England and Somerset Environmental Records Centre, so we can demonstrate how that landscape is improving from the point now into perpetuity. So keep monitoring that every year, year on year, and be able to demonstrate. Honeygar is really exciting for us. We're already driving that forward. But what I want to say is that it's not just about the Wildlife Trust doing that in isolation. We're doing it to test and trial, and we want to learn. And through that learning, we want to share that with the wider communities around us to demonstrate to them and allow them to benefit from those opportunities that we're exploring. And very, very finally, I'm just going to talk about restoring missing species. I've seen in the chat there's been a lot of talk around projects like beavers and pine marten. And that's something that the Wildlife Trust are really, really keen to explore over the next 10 years. We're already in the process of doing that now. So for example, with beavers, we're at the beginning of a process where we're actually looking at a framework and a strategy with other partners and other groups about how beavers might return to Somerset. We know we've got beavers in Somerset in enclosures, for example, at the National Trust of a project at Honeygar, and we know, on the Holmcott estate, and we also know that beavers have been reintroduced into other areas or in other areas of the southwest, for example, in the River Otter in Devon. So they're not far from Somerset. So we want to make sure that we develop the frameworks and the mechanisms that can model, that can support landowners and communities, and that mean that we're in the best place possible to manage for the return of what are amazing natural ecosystem engineers. Another example of a project we're working on at the moment is very, very early stages, but looking at the potential of how would Somerset be as a potential site for the return of the Dalmatian pelican. The Dalmatian pelican is one of, well, if it returned, would be one of the biggest birds in the country. But we need to make sure, is this landscape suitable for that? So we're currently looking at a project where we would actually look at the landscape, assess its ability at the moment to hold Dalmatian pelican. Would it be possible? And if it was possible, and it's not possible at the moment, what type of landscape would we need to have to make it possible? So it's all about using science and evidence at the core of our decision making. And finally, I just want to talk about the pine marten. There are lots of projects around the country that show that pine marten can have benefits, and there are lots of projects around the country that are looking at pine marten reintroductions. And we think that Somerset could be a key part of that, in terms of being part of a network of habitat and locations that would allow pine marten populations in other parts of the country to connect and re-establish. So it's a really, really exciting time to be working in Somerset Wildlife Trust. And as I say, I'm privileged to be here at this stage, and I'll just leave you with that message. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks to all of you for putting such a brilliant variety of questions. This is only the first of a number of sessions we're going to be doing, and obviously we can't answer all your questions. There are so many brilliant questions covering so many areas. What we will try to do is get them, if you put them in your feedback forms, we will try to find ways of answering them on the website. So I hope you don't mind, we can't answer them all today. The first question I'd like to ask the panel, particularly those who don't live in Somerset, Alistair and Andy, because obviously you're seeing it from outside, is what do you think are the main obstacles and difficulties that are in the way of the aims and ambitions of this plan, and how might we get over those?
Okay, well, I've been to the Somerset Levels many times in the past when I was in the Environment Agency, and obviously there will be a lot of challenges around the perceived impact on food production. We can't avoid that. I mean, people often ask me, you know, where would you rewild in Lowland Britain if you had a free reign? And all other things being equal, the Somerset Levels would be by far the best place to have a go in a lowland wetland situation. But it's just, I must tell you, it's just fantastic to hear Holly talking earlier and talking so much sense about soils and biodiversity and hedgerow management. And we need to get those messages out into the wider farming community. We're hoping public money for public goods approach through the ELM scheme will enable these conversations to be had more. But we got to face it, that is where there is going to be a real big kickback because of misunderstandings about nature-friendly farming, misunderstandings about rewilding.
Thanks very much, Andy.
Yeah, I would add to what Alistair said. I think one of the greatest obstacles that's been around and has the opportunity to be addressed now is the way different parts of those individuals and organisations that have a role in managing land come together and work together. And I think one of the things we've seen this evening in the launch of this strategy is a passion within the Wildlife Trust to create that feeling where people want to come and join in. And hearing from Holly and Alistair and others and Simon about the objectives and how inclusive those objectives are and how it's about explaining very, very well to people who might not understand straight away the benefits of all of these things coming together. I think that's really important. What I think also are barriers that we need to continue breaking down are the barriers to ensure that within government, the perverse kind of policies that also damage nature are minimized to some extent through our influencing capability. And I think we saw the Wildlife Trust's influencing capability to the fore in the Secretary of State's presentation, and the scrutiny of that managed so well by Craig yesterday. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. That brings me on to a question that someone's put to you, Holly, and I'm going to expand it slightly. People have asked whether the National Farmers Union are supporting the sort of work you and other farmers are doing. I'd also like you to perhaps explain, are you managing to convince your neighbours and your other, peers in the farming community? Are things starting to shift, or are you a sort of lonely voice of reason being ignored?
Putting me on the spot slightly. And so I would say that the NFU is committed to forward sort of thinking from the net zero perspective, and through that we are going to have changing farming practices. So they aren't outwardly currently suggesting some of the agroecological models which I would suggest are needed immediately with haste in terms of the biodiversity loss that's happening, but they are definitely pushing forwards for the soil health and the sort of better management of our farmland and rotational grazing. So they definitely see that farmers can be a real solution from a climate change perspective. I don't think that I am seen separately from my neighbours particularly. I think it's just about, as we're going forwards with the introduction of elms, changes are happening, and also with climate change, as a farming community, we've just come through yet another really dry spring, and we need to make changes as farmers to be able to keep producing food. And that's something that's really important to recognise, is we are sort of at the forefront of actually climatic change, and how are we going to deal with that? And actually these sort of natural solutions can get us there.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Another very good question here: how do we manage the expectations of the public? And particularly the question is asked, how long will it realistically be before people start to see changes in the landscape and appreciate it from their own experience rather than what they're told is happening? Alistair, that's probably one for you, and one for Georgia perhaps there.
Well, if you're working, as I touched on earlier, if you're working in a wetland environment, you can expect to see very significant changes in a year or two, because it's amazing, just amazing how wildlife will come. Obviously the mobile stuff, dragonflies and other aquatic invertebrates that fly around, and birds, etc. So that's the first thing to say, that if you're working in that environment, great. Very, very immediate responses. It's in Lowland Britain with rewilding projects, you can expect to see significant change in about 10 years. And that's what, I've been involved in that since it was a twinkle in the eye for the Burrells. And that's probably the time frame we're talking about. And that is challenging because we can't wait that long to inspire lots of other people. And the best way to inspire them is by getting on and doing it. But it's important that we promote these other, your jewels in the crown that are already perhaps smaller examples of the sorts of things that we aspire to. It's very important that we use animations and artists' impressions of what things will look like. And actually that's something we're focusing on, animations in Rewilding Britain, because people want to know, what does it look like? And hopefully we can inspire people that way. So it's a mixture of approaches, but we're lucky, you're lucky in Somerset. Things will change a lot quicker than they will up on top of the Howgills, which I'll be driving through tomorrow.
Simon or Georgia, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think, you know, what Alistair said, if you create space for nature, nature will come, and that can be at the large scale and at your back garden scale. So there can be some changes that happen very quickly. I saw just somebody post on Twitter today that they'd used an old sink in their garden to create a pond, and they had 5 different types of damselfly in it today. So it does come, but then there are the longer changes. And if I may link this back to the last question about barriers, I think one of the things is helping people understand what the perception of normal or natural is, and that actually we've all got used to a level of normal that isn't really normal. We've got acclimatized to a loss of nature, and we need to help people to shift their views so that they're looking long term to see that we need to restore nature together. And there's that fantastic proverb that I will completely misquote about planting, a wise person plants a tree whose shade they will never sit under or sit in, or something like that. And you know, it's getting those messages across as well. So nature will come and things will happen immediately, but longer term we need to get people to just to view the long term, and that's part of our role, isn't it, in connecting people to the natural world.
Yes, I remember Barbara Young saying just add water and it happens miraculously, as Alistair said. And then someone else said it's very easy to rewild that ancient woodland as long as you don't mind waiting 500 years. But, you know, somewhere in between, hopefully. There's been a number of comments. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, Stephen, just to add something, I think what's really important as well is the objective in the strategy that you would like 1 in 4 people participating. And I do think citizen science is one of the ways in which it helps people really engage with the changes that are ambitiously wanted here.
Absolutely. There have been a number of very interesting comments, and this is always a controversial and difficult area. The idea of reintroducing high-profile species. Well, actually, the beaver and the pine martins are in Somerset already. They're here. Pelicans, I don't think, are yet. And there was a white-tailed eagle in my village last year. So, you know, they are coming. But a number of people have made very valid comments, and perhaps the two are not mutually exclusive, that perhaps we need to focus more on lapwings and yellowhammers and house sparrows and skylarks before we think about pelicans. Or do you think that we don't need to make that choice, that we can have both the glamorous exotic new species that help publicize places like this, like the storks at Knepp, but also help the often very neglected once common species that have now become very scarce?
Yeah, absolutely right, Stephen. It's not a binary choice. So, you know, we need both, but we can use one particular example, and I'll go back to my past. You know, I was involved in setting up all the otter habitat recovery projects with the Wildlife Trust in the Thames catchment in the late 80s and 90s, and it generated a huge amount of conservation effort, volunteer engagement, awareness raising of the importance of rivers, the health of rivers, etc. Using a flagship species. And yes, we created lots of habitat. Now, to be honest, otters would have returned anyway, sooner or later. Perhaps they came back a little bit quicker and did a little bit better because of it. But, you know, we shouldn't be ashamed of using some of these flagship species to help promote wider conservation. But that doesn't mean that we just do the flagship introductions. We got to carry on with all the great conservation work for waders and rare butterflies, etc. as well.
On a wider level, do we think that, you mentioned the word binary there, Alistair, and it's a very important thing, isn't it? That, and again, number of questions about, you know, how can we bridge this gap, which we appear to be doing here, between farmers and conservationists? You know, why is it always seen as different sides? You know, we have to have this, but we can't have that. You know, it's food production or wildlife. Now, all your presentations tonight have made it very clear that these are not binary choices, that everyone can win from these. More jobs, more health for people. So what can we do overall to promote this? Because people have asked about people in towns in Somerset, about certain groups of people, people with disabilities who can't necessarily access these places. So how are we going to make this vision inclusive? That's a big question, but I'd like to hear that from all of you, really, if possible.
I'll go first, if you like, Stephen. So I think what you're doing this evening is a classic example of it. We've had experienced, long-serving nature conservationists talking alongside an absolutely stunning presentation about modern, progressive, regenerative farming. And, you know, putting people together like that who have a similar view of the fact that we have two crises here, a carbon crisis and a biodiversity crisis, and that the management of land, whether you're a farmer or you're a nature conservationist, the use of the land is the key to this. And for me, I've often said, and I will continue to say, that it would really benefit us all if we could have a government-led land use strategy for England and the UK to recognise that it's not about farmers or nature conservationists, it's simply about those who manage and use the land in an effective, modern and careful and sensitive way.
If I can jump in there to build on what Andy said there, I think so this evening we've focused mostly with speakers on focusing on our goal 1, if you like, in our strategy, and we will be doing an event later in the year on goal 2, which is about the building a movement for nature and the Team Wilder approach and getting 1 in 4 people taking action. And part of that is about us learning from communities about how we can be more inclusive. So that is definitely part of the thinking around the strategy, and not pretending that we have got all the answers, or that it's a case of us setting up a project and saying come and join in, but actually saying, what are your ideas, what do you want to do, how can we support you, what is it that we could do that would help you get your ideas off the ground, or also how can we connect the communities within Somerset who are doing amazing things, but perhaps doing it in isolation and could get more by working together or sharing successes and sharing failures, because actually we can often learn even more from those, can't we? So that's definitely part of the Team Wilder approach that we're going to be building on. So please do, if people are interested in that, look out for the event. And I have seen quite a lot of comments in the chat as well about, you know, making more bridges with farmers. Obviously we are trying to do that this evening. And we are working a lot more with farmers, and that's definitely a key element of the strategy is to say, you know, how can we support farmers as well? We know that farmers are very connected to their land and that they want to do the right thing. So how can we do that? That's definitely a key part of the strategy as well. And then you mentioned accessibility, Stephen. That's another thing that we are looking at. We're looking at putting in more accessible boardwalks, car parks, hides on some of our reserves. And also looking at creating a digital virtual reserve that people can visit from the luxury of their own home, potentially doing citizen science through monitoring online. So all of these things are being thought about and in development.
Thank you. Holly, I was wondering, in your community and amongst your, again, fellow, not just farmers, in your community, do you think this is the sort of strategy that will resonate with them, that will make them think actually people, you know, the conservationists do care and we're all part of the same team, if you like?
I think, you know, work needs to be done on breaking down barriers, but actually getting on the table and having these conversations, because I think the word rewilding, you know, that sort of puts fear in farmers. And so it's wonderful to have listened to Alistair's presentation where we really talk about that integration and that it's not, you know, food production is part of that. So I think sometimes it's just about having a conversation and breaking down those barriers, because I do want to say that farmers really do care. And I think sometimes farmers are pushed into points, you know, they work extremely long hours and they have really tight margins. And I think sometimes you can end up going down a road you don't necessarily want to go down. And actually, if you have support or you meet other like-minded fellows, then that can actually be all you need to really bring about change. And it's always about presenting evidence. So one of the things I'm doing is, you know, we're very open and honest about sort of the finances and the impact we're having. And actually, these methods of farming, they don't need to have an impact on your bottom line. In fact, they can actually improve things and also improve your work-life balance as well, is a good way of putting it. But yeah, I think we just need to empower our communities, and that's farming communities and building bridges together. So, you know, there's a lot of projects starting up across Somerset in terms of market gardens, you know, community interest companies. You know, there's a really good grassroots level happening, and there's a lot of ways of getting involved. And sometimes that can be just something really simple, by going and talking to someone or sharing a post on social media. You don't need to necessarily buy a product from them, but it's just about sharing the message. You know, you don't need to be farming or working the land yourself.
Thanks very much. Just got time for two more questions. One brief one, which perhaps is something that the trust need to answer really. Climate change, the climate emergency, the elephant in the room. We can do a lot of this wonderful work, but if we're going to lose quite substantial portions of Somerset with managed retreat or disastrous unmanaged retreat of the coast, that's going to be an issue. What is the trust's policy, Georgia, on how we deal with the real emergency of climate change, as well as obviously this other really important work?
How we deal with climate change. So the Wildlife Trust, as Somerset Wildlife Trust, we're obviously part of a movement of 46 wildlife trusts. And nationally, we do a lot of national focused political work. Craig Bennett, many of you will have heard about, talks about climate change all the time. So our greatest power is looking at how we do that together, how we mobilise together. And there will be a new national strategy from the Wildlife Trust, hopefully this year, which has climate change at the heart. So there's going to be a lot more around that coming soon from wildlife trusts. And in Somerset, obviously, it is a key element of what we're looking at in our strategy, looking at it from our perspective, what are we strong in, which is land management. So how can we use that to combat climate change by carbon storage? So we're doing a lot of work around that, which is the nature-based solutions angle that Simon was looking at. And then through our Team Wilder approach, it's about getting messages out there and working with communities to take action. And we're also doing a lot of work about our own carbon impacts as well. So there's a big piece of work happening at the minute about our own carbon emissions strategy. So there's lots of different angles that we're taking around this, but clearly it's a massive issue, and all the things that we've talked about tonight about working together and breaking down the barriers is absolutely key. Thanks, Georgia.
Finally, a number of people have talked about the issue of national parks in Britain, and recently I think we had to invent a new grade in Europe for national parks because ours was so bad they had to become grade 5. Is there a possibility that we create a sort of coast to hills to levels national park with the Avalon Marshes as its centre? Or, and I think Andy might be a good person to answer this, or are national parks something we just need to put aside, forget about, they're not really working, you know, or could we resurrect them with this wonderful area we have in Somerset?
So we definitely aren't going to sideline national parks, I don't think, despite the grade that you've talked about, Stephen. And I think the Glover review and how the government want to implement that will be important. But whatever they say, what we really need are designated landscapes, both national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty to do, is to do more for biodiversity and climate change than they've been doing to date. And our constituency, the people around this table this evening, the Wildlife Trust can play their part in putting pressure on the government and on the national parks and AONBs to do their bit for the kinds of things that are in the ambitious strategy of this Wildlife Trust. So they're something for the future, but they've got to do better than they've been doing to date, my view.
Thanks, Andy. Alistair?
Yeah, so just to flag that we're about to launch a campaign for national parks. We are calling for 10% of national parks to be rewilding, core rewilding areas, and a further 50% to be nature friendly, nature recovery areas. So in other words, double the 30% figures that we talked about earlier. We await the Glover review, but the thing I wanted to say is there's no point designating new national parks if we can't get the existing ones to function as they were set up to function. So so yeah, let's get that house in order first. In the meantime, great organisations like yours are ploughing on and doing brilliant things outside the national parks, and hopefully what that will do is demonstrate that what could be done within national parks if there was a government drive for the park authorities to do that, and that they were supported financially by government to do that. So that's what we'll be calling for soon. We're about to launch our campaign within the next couple of weeks. Thank
you very much, Alistair. I'd just like to wrap up now, firstly thanking our guests, Holly, Alistair and Andy. Well, Holly's both a guest and part of the trust now because she's now a trustee, which is wonderful. We have another farmer as a trustee joining us soon as well. So I think we are demonstrating that we practice what we preach here. Obviously also thank Georgia and Simon for all the fantastic work they do. The staff of the trust are brilliant. People behind this, Lucy and her team who've put this together, and Kirby, and all the staff and volunteers of the trust. And in particular, I want to thank the audience. What's fantastic about the people we attract to things like this is you're not just going to sit there and listen. You are going to argue, you're going to put good questions to us, you're going to challenge us, and that's what we need. That's why I think this strategy is so robust, because you have challenged us, you have asked awkward questions, and that's great. That's what we want. So thank you so much for coming tonight. More information about Wilder Somerset is going to be shared at the AGM and Members Day in November this year, which may or may not be face-to-face. Hopefully it will be, and online as well, probably. In the meantime, you can register for our e-news and visit the Somerset Wildlife Trust website, and we can keep you up to date. And there's a link in the chat box, but again, it will be on the website. You can donate to us. I won't say what Bob Geldof once said, but you know what I mean. So give us your money if you can. We really appreciate it, because we do put it to very good work. And you can click on the link in the chat box to donate. We will send you a feedback survey. Please complete it. It's always so helpful to hear your thoughts, your suggestions, your comments. And of course, you can reiterate your questions if we haven't had time to answer them, and we really will try to do it. And we're going to leave you with a Team Wilder video. Just finally, on a personal note, I'm incredibly proud to be president of the Somerset Wildlife Trust. I don't really have to do anything except things like this, and I get to work with these incredible people, or watch them work really, doing this fantastic work. And I think what's at the heart of this, which I'm so impressed by, is people coming together to make things work for everyone and for everywhere. And that's the key thing. This isn't the little bits of Somerset at the Good for Nature Wildlife Trust, it's the whole of Somerset Wildlife Trust. So we're going to share a short video with you now. Thank you very much, and hope to see you again in events like this.
Look outside your door and you'll find some of the UK's most wonderful wildlife, from bats, birds and butterflies to poppies and pond life. But times are changing. You may already know that the humble hedgehog is in trouble. 95% of our prickly pals have already disappeared, and they're not alone. One by one, the calls of turtle doves and nightingales have disappeared too. The rate of decline started slowly, but it's speeding up. we're approaching an irreversible tipping point. But with your help, we can tip the scales back into nature's favour. If just 1 in 4 people are willing to take action that supports our wildlife, we can transform our counties. You can start as small and as local as you like. You could cut a hole in your garden fence to create a hedgehog highway, plant bee-friendly flowers in your window box, or join like-minded neighbours in lobbying your local MP. Each contribution can make a big difference. Like the butterfly that flaps its wings and causes a tornado. Whatever action you take, Team Wilder can help. Join Team Wilder today and you'll find all the advice, training and support you, your school or your community needs. So why not join Team Wilder now and start mending our broken nature network?